You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Pond University is your one-stop shop for all things pond management. It is hosted by Mitchell Ziske and Megan Gunn from Purdue University and Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant. Join us as we talk with biologists, managers, and pond owners about the topics and tools needed to manage your pond for good habitat and great fishing. So grab a notebook and a beverage and sit back and enjoy Pond University. G'day everyone, I'm Mitch, and I'm joined again as always by Megan. Hi Megan.
Hi Mitch, how are you doing today?
I'm good, how are you?
I'm good, I'm enjoying the sunshine for sure.
Yeah, it's been some great weather. We're recording this episode in early November here in Indiana, and we've got some 70-degree weather, so it sort of goes against the title of this episode, but it's definitely nice to have some weather. So it's good to see that we're back. We weren't cut after the first episode, so that's good news. Yeah. And so we've got an exciting episode today. We're going to talk a little bit about what happens to ponds in winter, and we seem, it's fairly timely for what's happening here. And we're going to bring in a guest today who's going to tell us how we can manage our pond to perhaps limit some of the negative impacts that winter can have on ponds and on fish populations. Before we get started, Megan, what have you been up to over the past couple of weeks between these episodes?
I've been really busy, Mitch. I've had a lot of conferences that I've been attending virtually.
Okay.
It seems that everything got canceled in the beginning of quarantine, and now they have figured out how to run everything efficiently. So I've been doing a lot of conferencing, but that seems to be it, or that seems to have consumed my life. But what about you?
I've been busy too. I'm teaching a couple of classes here at Purdue, and so it's been interesting teaching those mostly remotely this semester. Adds a fair bit of extra work, but so learning new technologies, learning new tips and tricks to keep students engaged virtually. And I've been trying to enjoy some of the nicer weather we've had. I've managed to get out fishing a couple times over the past few weeks. Caught some smallmouth bass here locally, which was fun. Didn't fish in any ponds, but fished in some reservoirs and some rivers, so that's been good.
That's awesome. Are you missing being in the classroom?
I am a little bit. I really enjoy the interaction with students, and so it's been difficult for me, not having that interaction. I still try and record my classes, and I make sure that I have my video on so they can see my face, and I have some homework activities that they do where they need to record a little video of themselves answering some questions, and so I do get to have that sort of face-to-face interaction, which has been good, and the students seem to enjoy that. But it's definitely not the same as being in the classroom and interacting with them and talking to them one-on-one. So,
for sure.
So in the first episode of this podcast, we really got a great overview of the pond ecosystem. We spoke to Logan Haldeman, and he told us all about the abiotic and biotic factors in ponds, the non-living and the living factors, and some of the things that influences those and how we can manage those. And so that is a really good jumping off point for today's episode, because we're going to be looking at how winter impacts ponds, and the way that winter impacts ponds is by changing a lot of these abiotic factors, and that then can go on and change how fish populations behave and things like that.
Do you think we'll have a winter this year? It's 70 degrees in November. This is crazy.
That's a good question. I mean, I wouldn't mind if winter didn't come this year. I'm from a warm climate back in Australia, and I don't like the cold. I've learned to embrace the different seasons here in the Midwest, but I appreciate winter, and I could definitely enjoy a 2 to 4 week winter, but that's a good point. 70 degrees in November, so I don't know what we're in for this year. Essential Pond Terms, the segment where we hope to expand your vocabulary by defining important terms for pond management. The first term we'll talk about is stratification. Stratification is the separation of water layers in a pond or lake. This separation occurs because of different densities in those water layers. What drives these densities is typically temperature. So water is most dense at 39 degrees Fahrenheit. So any water that is warmer than that will actually be less dense, or any water that is cooler than that will also be less dense. In the summertime, the warmer water will actually sit at the surface of the pond, and as that water continues to warm, it will stay at the surface, strengthening that separation between the cooler water deeper in the pond. Stratification is important because dissolved oxygen will differ between those different layers in the water column. At the surface, the oxygen can exchange with the surface of the pond, and the plants growing in that sunlit surface will also add oxygen to that surface layer. However, the deeper layer in the pond can become devoid of oxygen because of organisms in there using that oxygen up without being able to replenish that oxygen. One way that you can reduce stratification in a pond is through aeration. Aeration is where you physically move water around to try and break down this stratification. One type of aeration is where you put a bubbler on the bottom of your pond. What this bubbler does is it pushes air up, and with it pushes water up from the bottom of the pond towards the surface. Not only does it bring this water close to the surface so that it can be reoxygenated, but it also helps circulate the water in that pond, breaking down the stratification. Another type of aeration you can have is a surface paddler. This just creates a whole bunch of agitation on the surface and actually helps increase the exchange of oxygen at the water's surface. Our guest today will talk about both of these types of aeration. Today we're joined by Dave Osborne, who's an extension educator for Purdue. He's located in Ripley County and he has lots of experience with pond management. So, hi Dave, how are you?
Just fine.
Great. So I hope you're enjoying some of this nice weather we're having here at the moment.
Yeah, I love the outdoors. I love deer hunting and fall fishing, and the cool down helps both of those. So yeah, I love the cool weather.
Yeah, great. It's a beautiful time to be out and about here in the Midwest for sure. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Dave. How long have you been at Purdue? What's your background? How long have you been working in ponds, that sort of thing?
I've been an extension educator in my 28th year.
Wow.
My degrees are in forest and wildlife management from Purdue. Took a lot of fisheries classes. I've been involved in ponds since I could walk, and my dad could take me to the pond and go fishing. But I've always loved pond management. I grew up in South Central Indiana, where most of our fishing happened in farm ponds, and was always the kind of kid that wondered why this is happening or what's that or things like that. So I've always had that, and I think at 57 I still have that. What's going on? Why is this doing that? So I've always had an interest in ponds, and I think around the state of Indiana, in extension anyway, I'm kind of known as the pond guy. If you got a pond question, call Dave.
Yeah. Absolutely. I know that's my motto. If I've got a question, I call Dave as well. So it's been great working with you, Dave, these past few years. And you've taught me a lot about ponds and pond management. And hopefully, through some of the programming that we do, we can help more and more landowners and pond owners in Indiana manage their ponds better.
That's always our goal, is that good management and research-based management, not just go to the internet and find an answer, but make sure that we've got some research behind what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely. And so, what are some of the pond projects that you've worked on over the years that that stick out in your mind? They don't have to be related to what we're talking about today with winter, but just some of the exciting pond things that you've worked on that you might want to share with our listeners.
I get a lot of calls on fish kills. So I've been out on a lot of different fish kill calls and seen a lot of different reasons why we tend to lose fish during the summer, during the spring, during the fall, and even during the winter. So I always get a lot of calls with that. I get a lot of calls with vegetation management, of course. And then, it's always, what do I need to stock because my fish aren't growing? So everybody wants their fish to grow well. And so I get called out to do some basic pond surveys, which is my favorite thing to do because the only way I have to survey them is with my fishing pole. So that's always a very fun, get out of the office and go catch a dozen fish and talk to them about whether they're stunted or whether they're actively growing and things like that. The last couple of years, with my drone that I have, I've flown a lot of ponds and we put tilapia in them the end of May and 1st of June to look at how tilapia impact vegetation in ponds. 2 nights ago, the water temperature hit 50 degrees in one of the lakes, and we actually went and harvested almost 50 tilapia by dipping them at night because they were so cold they couldn't get away. And the family said that they were very tasty. So they actually got to eat their weed control. So I've done some tilapia work. I'm really excited to maybe get a graduate student to kind of take this to the next level. But that's kind of been my seat of the pants kind of research. I've had over 30 ponds in the last 3 years that I put tilapia in and followed them on a monthly basis with drone flights to look at vegetation results from putting tilapia in ponds.
That's really cool. Have you had a lot of people call you during quarantine because they're at home and kind of more focused on their ponds recently compared to other years?
I never did quit going to ponds. I figured we could socially distance at a pond. So I've probably traveled more counties and further away during the quarantine this summer because people are at home more. And that algae that used to not bother them that much when they just mowed around the pond, if they have to see it every day, it bothered them more and more. So yeah, I think in general, people being at home made them more interested in not only their ponds but their yards or their trees or shrubs. In general, that a lot more calls with general maintenance of their natural environment around their homes and things. So
that's really neat.
Yeah, that's great. I think the more that people pay attention to their properties, ponds, their woodlands or whatever, I think that's only a good thing, right? They're going to learn more about them. They're going to be more interested in learning some of the science behind why things happen, and hopefully that then leads to better management of their property. Pond Species Profile, the segment where we will showcase the biology and ecology of popular and not so popular pond species.
This week we are highlighting the largemouth bass. Largemouth bass are a part of the sunfish family and typically grow to be 10 to 20 inches. They are opportunistic feeders, which means they will feed on anything that opportunity presents. When they are young, they typically feed on crustaceans, insects, and insect larvae, while the adults mostly feed on fish, crayfish, and large insects. But as I mentioned, as the opportunity arises, they will also eat frogs and any other small mammals that fall into the water. They typically start reproducing when they are 2 years old and can live on average to about 10 to 12 years. And speaking of spawning, they typically spawn around May when the waters get warmer in the spring, peak in June, and then continue through July. They may spawn into August and September as long as conditions are favorable. They are top predators in many ecosystems and are considered keystone species or having those key roles because they do control that top-down relationship in the food web. They're also a very important and extremely important sport fish here in the United States, but they serve as a food source around the world. One way to distinguish largemouth bass versus other bass that you may have in your pond is by looking at the upper jaw and to see if it extends past the eye. That is indicative of a largemouth bass. Happy fishing.
So what we're here to talk about today, it's despite it being 70 degrees outside, it is getting close to being winter. Hope maybe. And so in the last episode we spoke a lot about the different living and non-living factors in a pond. The fish and vegetation, obviously, but also things like temperature and oxygen and turbidity. And so I thought it would be great to talk a little bit about how these things change in fall and into winter, and then some of the things that people can do to try and prevent the negative impacts that these changes can have. So Dave, in your experience, how do you see ponds change, through the fall period and then into winter?
Okay, so when Mother Nature starts cooling that water temperature down, a lot of these green plants, the algae, the duckweed, watermeal, all these plants are ending their annual cycle. We have perennials in our ponds, we have annuals in our ponds, so they're finishing their life cycle. The numbers are going down. The sheer mass of algae and rooted plants in the pond are decreasing. The photo period's decreasing, so they're producing less oxygen in a daily basis, which means they're respirating longer hours at night, so they're producing more CO2. The advantage we have, though, is that water temperature is coming down, and colder water holds a whole lot more oxygen than warm water. So our oxygen net benefit typically is we have better oxygenated water as we move into winter.
Okay, so the cold water is holding more oxygen, and so the water's cooling in the fall. Plants are producing less oxygen because there's less sunlight, in a day. The plants are decreasing in biomass, so I imagine there's quite a lot of those plants that are dying off. And can those plant die-offs cause issues in the ponds in the fall?
Yeah, as soon as that plant material dies, it quits producing oxygen, and the degradation and decomposition of that plant material creates CO2, as well as some other possibilities. It can create some nitrates and methane and different things like that, but CO2 is the big one. So a huge die-off, if you had a huge volume or plant volume in a pond, could be very detrimental in the amount of CO2 that it's creating, just because of the degradation and decomposition of that. One of the things I tell people is you want to go into the fall with that under control. So we manage all spring and summer to not have a huge fall die-off that's going to cause us some of these issues.
Yeah, that's a really good point. If you it's sort of like if you let your lawn grow all year long and then just mowed it once in the fall, it's going to be pretty horrendous to manage. And if you can, I think that's a very good point. Managing your aquatic vegetation, keeping that biomass down, means that there's not going to be that huge biomass in the fall to die off. And building on that, I often get questions from pond owners saying, well, should I be treating some of this stuff in the fall? And typically, I say to them, well, number one, Mother Nature is going to take care of your problem for you here pretty soon anyway. But number two, because you are getting this die-off of vegetation in the fall, you don't want to be adding any additional die-off unnecessarily as well. So,
yeah, I'm a very practical manager, so I think it's a waste of money. If people call me at Labor Day or things like that, and they're having a family outing, they want to treat their beach area, hey, there's no problem with doing that. But once we get into October and November, they don't need to waste the chemical and waste the effort and the input of those chemicals into the system is really gaining them nothing.
Are there any plants in or around a pond that you should be thinking of treating in the fall?
Yeah, the emerged plants, some of your emerged vegetation, for example, cattails, rushes, things like that. Those plants are now turning their system around from creating seed to developing a root system. So if we want a systemic herbicide like glyphosate to do a better job with managing cattails and things like that, we want a fall application because then that translocates the chemical, that systemic herbicide, into the root system and helps us get a better control than it is just burning the tops off of them in the spring.
Right. So while your summer period, you might be focusing on treating some of the submergent vegetation or the algae in your pond, the fall's a good time to switch to maybe treating some of that emergent vegetation.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the best time to treat it to get the most effect.
Okay, and that emergent vegetation is something we'd consider perennial, right? Those roots and those plants will stay there year after year.
Yes. Most of those aquatic plants are definitely perennial. Um, and if we had them on terrestrial areas like cattails, they would be actually called things like Johnson grass. So cattails are basically the aquatic version of Johnson grass with rhizomes, and so controlling them one fall doesn't mean you've controlled the cattails. It's a couple season approach if you're really wanting to control them. But I tell people every year, don't kill them all, because there's a lot of benefit to those emerged weeds in the whole ecosystem of that pond. So
Yeah, that's a great point. I know in our last episode, Logan spoke about, the benefits of vegetation in a pond, both submergent and emergent, and then we spoke a little bit about buffer strips and how some of that emergent vegetation can prevent excessive nutrients and excessive sediment going into the pond. So we've spoken, so you mentioned vegetation and how vegetation changes in a pond as winter approaches. What are some other things that change in a pond, say temperature or oxygen or?
yeah, so in the fall, stratification tends to lessen if we're talking about that summer stratification. As the water cools, 39 to 40 degree water is the heaviest, most dense water. So as that water temperature cools down, that 39 to 40 degree water is going to head to the bottom of the pond. And then we're going to stack cooler temperatures up in that pond. That is what's called turnover. And when that opposite happens in the spring, that's turnover. I get a lot of people call me and say my fish died because my pond turned over. It's a little different situation when we're dealing with summer, because that's more of an oxygen stratification mixing, but a pond naturally turns over. So it's going to turn over in the fall. That cool water that we have, as long as we don't have ice out or the ice hasn't formed, is very high oxygenated water, very, very aerobic environment. So the zooplankton, the phytoplankton, the small algae, the sunlight penetrates to the weeds that are still there. It's just a really, really happy time for ponds. Fish are in good shape. They've got plenty of oxygen. There's still some food sources in there for fish to feed on. In a warm day, a sunny day, you'll actually have insect hatches through November, December, even into January a lot of times.
Really?
So there's a lot of, it's a happy time while that there's no ice on. As soon as we ice that pond up as we go into winter, this whole thing starts to change a little bit. We actually sealed that pond over. So the gas exchange, the CO2 leaving, the oxygen coming from the atmosphere into the water, that whole exchange system, we just put a cap on it. And so now the gas exchange and the CO2 exchange and the oxygen exchange, that is very limited now because there's no open water. So what oxygen's in that pond, as long as that ice is clear and sunlight can penetrate and get to the green plants can still produce oxygen. They give off CO2 at night, but there's a net benefit or a net to the good of oxygen production. But if that ice becomes milky or really thick or snow covered and the light cannot penetrate, all of a sudden those green plants that have been producing oxygen all along are now respirating 24 hours a day, creating CO2. The fish are metabolizing and creating CO2. So if we get an ice situation in the winter with a long covering of ice, that's when we end up with trouble and low oxygen levels and start losing fish for an extended period of time if we've got ice with snow cover. So as long as that pond stays winter with very little ice on it, that pond's in a very, very happy place. It's when we get ice and we get it covered with snow that pond can start becoming a stressful environment.
And just thinking about some of the bodies of water we've had around here, it's been a few years since we've had some ponds that have been able to completely freeze over with snow cover on top of them.
Yes. My office knows that when we get 4 inches of ice down in these neck of the woods, the ponds that I have to manage for landowners that I've told them I would manage their populations, Dave's gone for a week and on vacation because he's going ice fishing every day. I have ice fished in the last 2 years, 1 day.
Wow.
So ponds have been very, very low stress situations, very, very little ice cover for extended periods of time. So we've had very little winter problems with ponds, at least in the southern part of the state. Northern Indiana, as you get north of Indianapolis, they tend to always have some time, to do some ice fishing. And then as you get up around, northern Indiana, southern Michigan, they always have enough time to ice fish. Ice isn't the biggest factor. It's that ice gets covered with snow or it becomes a milky color, and it doesn't let the light penetrate. That's where we get into trouble when we start losing our oxygen levels.
Okay, and I'm sure, like with everything, there's a lot of variables associated with this, but in your experience, how long does a pond have to be covered with ice and snow for some of these processes to start causing fish kills?
If we went into the fall with a very, very, very low, biomass as far as huge amounts of algae or duckweed or water meal or plant die-off, so we don't have a lot of decomposition, the pond can do pretty well even with a month, 5 or 6 weeks of ice cover, because they're not degrading or decomping a lot of plant material. But in a pond that's got a lot of that, a week could make that pond very stressful, and you could actually start losing fish. So it's really dependent on the health of the whole system that we go into that ice cover. So some ponds can go 4 to 6 weeks without any issue whatsoever. Other ponds, if there's a lot of other things going on in that pond, a week or so can make it stressful enough that they could start losing fish.
So my research focused on flowing streams, right? And so I know that we talked about the dying vegetation. Would it be helpful if those landowners went and removed some of that vegetation before the winter came over, like is one of the processes that they did to prepare for winter, or do you just let it happen naturally?
I guess you'd have to look at that pond individually. Physically removing some of that vegetation could help in that situation. The other thing that can help is in the winter, a deep pond tends to be in a little better shape. And by deep, I mean you've got at least 10 or 12 foot of water in that pond. The shallow ponds that are very vernal, that are very nutrient rich, that only have 5 to 6 foot of water, they probably are more suspect to winter kills. They're safer in the summer a lot of times, but they're more risky in the winter. So it's depth, it's amount of plant material, it's things like that. I would rather see them manage that plant material all summer than to just try to rake out a bunch of it in the fall. But raking out some of that plant material is never going to hurt anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess it depends on the type of plant material you have and the size of your pond, whether or not mechanical removal of those plants is even feasible. But
I've got clients that have two 2-acre lakes side by side, exactly the same location, and they've lost fish in the one lake 3 or 4 times since I've known them, and the other lake has never had a fish kill, and they're almost exactly the same depth in the same situation. And what's going on with one pond versus the other? The one pond that's had the fish kill in it is the upper pond in this system, and it drains to the lower pond. And I think there's almost maybe a spring that moves water through that lower pond, and it just has a better oxygenation characteristic. And why one pond's that much different than another when they're not 30 feet apart, I don't know, but they definitely act differently.
That's interesting. And I think that highlights a good point that, the information that we try and provide through our publications and even on this podcast, for the most part, they're generalizations, and each pond is unique and you can use some of this information to inform your decisions. But I think being able to work with someone like Dave or a pond consultant or something else can really be invaluable if you're having specific problems to your pond.
A good rule of thumb that I use with clients when they call me and they're concerned about winter fish kill is the management of the vegetation we've talked about. But when you get snow cover in a pond and they're concerned about that, is to go out and rake that snow and use a ice auger or something like that and pop holes in the ice so that you get sunlight penetration, and you break that solid cover of ice to let some gas exchange happen. And so we can manage that ice situation that way with the physical deal. But the safest thing that we can do in a farm pond, especially if we've got enough depth to have aeration, is aerate the pond. It keeps it safer in the summer. It keeps it safer in the winter. If you have a lot of value for your fish, your best insurance policy year in and year out, day in and day out, is pond aeration.
Okay. Yeah, I get a lot of questions about that from people too. And I have some friends here locally that have a couple of ponds, and for a long time they used to just aerate one of their ponds, and that pond would consistently do better through the winter and through the summer. And so now they've invested and they're aerating both ponds. And they have some waterfowl that they want to provide access to the water in the winter too. So they've got a few different reasons why they want to aerate, but I've seen that it's really improved their fish populations and it's decreased the fish kills that they get, particularly through the winter.
The only reason I dislike aeration is a lot of times it's hard to get to ice fish that pond because it doesn't form enough safe ice to get out on it. And I guess that's a personal bias, but from a safety perspective, there isn't a safer way to do that. And in the winter, as long as there's not ice cover, they don't have to run that aerator through the winter. And a matter of fact, if the ice is 3 or 4 inches and it's clear and doesn't have snow on it, they don't need to run it then. It's when that snow cover happens that they can say, hey, it just covered, I have no light penetration. I can turn my aerator on. They're pretty safe to do that in the winter. In the summer, once you turn it on in May, you should leave it on all summer. The summer's a little different dynamic, but in the winter, you can selectively use that in the winter and do just fine.
Okay, that's good to know. I know everybody wants to try and reduce costs of electricity and be as efficient as they can, and so that's good to know. And I know that if you're stressed about your pond, icing over, getting snow on it, and you're looking to get out and do some of that mechanical removal, that can be a little risky if there's not a lot of ice, and so keeping some of that open with an aerator, solves a lot of those problems without risking your safety.
Yeah. My other favorite way to reduce the oxygen budget in a pond is to remove hundreds and hundreds of bluegill. That means there's less fish down there needing oxygen, and they go in my freezer. So that's my other favorite way to manage oxygen levels in a winter pond.
That sounds great. And we're going to cover some fish management topics here on this podcast, and you'll hear that harvest is one of the best ways to manage sunfish in the pond. Bluegill and red ear, and in most ponds I see that they are overabundant, and so I think removing them for fun and to eat is great. Removing them to help with that oxygen budget, but it can also really help your fish populations in the long run too.
And so you're out there moving, you're drilling holes, you can remove some snow to get light penetration. You're removing some fish. You're keeping the fish population at a healthier level. A lot of times our winter fish kills happen in populations of a lot of stunted fish and just thousands and thousands of too many fish. So if we keep that management, that population in a good place, that's all going to bode well for being safer.
Yep. And it's, we in this podcast, we, focus in on a few topics here and there for each episode, but I think what our listeners will come to see is that, managing a pond is really one big sort of holistic process where the things that you do for vegetation can help fish, and the things that you do for fish can help with your oxygen and reducing your fish kills, and all of these things are linked together. And I think hopefully some of the information that we provide listeners and the people that go to our website, they can start to piece some of these factors together and look at their pond more as a year-long sort of management program rather than just trying to spot treat problems as they arise.
Most of the time when people call me, they've kind of missed the initial window because they already have the problem, and fixing the problem after you have the problem is very, very hard to do. Sometimes we miss the window for an application of herbicide, or we've missed the window. The fish are already stressed and they're already dying. So now how do we get oxygen in there? So there aren't a lot of quick fixes for problems that are already in process. The way to manage that is to be proactive, not reactive, because reactive management in a pond situation very seldom is very efficient.
And I would guess it would get kind of expensive also.
Yeah, absolutely. So Dave, you mentioned aeration and the benefits of aeration in the winter and the summer. Is aeration, is all aeration the same? Are there different types of different ways that people can aerate their pond? I just wondered if you have any experience using different types of aerators, fountains versus bubblers or anything like that.
Yeah, fountains typically, unless they're an aerating fountain, are just decorative. So fountains do very little. A lot of people think when we blow the water out into the air and it falls through the air and falls back on the water, that's how we aerate water. That has nothing to really do with aeration. Diffused aeration, which we put a bubbler or a diffuser on the bottom of a pond, the bubbles come out of that diffuser. What they're actually doing is physically lifting that water to the surface. And our goal in a proper aeration in a pond is to lift the water in that pond to the surface once every 24 hours. And when it contacts the surface, it's aerated. Not that those bubbles can't put some oxygen in the water, but that the system there is that air is not aerating the water. It's simply mechanically lifting the water and circulating the water. So for that to properly happen, we have to have enough depth to set up that circulation or that stirring. And typically that depth is in smaller ponds, at least 8 to 10 feet. If we get a pond less than 8 feet, say 6 feet is the maximum depth, we're not looking at diffused aeration being effective because we can't get the mixing and stirring. So then we're looking for a paddle type aerator that just splashes and beats the heck out of the water and moves the water around and creates some stirring of a shallow water situation. And it's not diffused aeration, it's actually more mechanical aeration. So looking at your pond and the characteristics of your pond tells you which of those approaches is best for your pond situation.
So going back to the diffused aeration, you said this happens once every 24 hours. Does it happen for like 15 minutes or does it happen for just is that a 5-minute process? What's the best?
Yeah, you're running that 24/7. So you're sizing this diffuser and the system that you put in so that it stirs that pond completely in a 24-hour period.
Oh, I gotcha.
So you're running it 24/7. It's just sized so that you're stirring that entire pond. So if you've got a 2-acre lake, you may need 3 or 4 diffusers, where if you've got a 3/4 acre lake, you may only need 1. And to run 3 diffusers, you may need 1.5 horsepower, or to run 1, you need 0.5 horsepower. So when you get the people that sell aerators and manage that and create a plan for you, they're going to look at size and depth and all that, and you've got to size the system to get that once every 24 hours stirring. That's your goal in aeration.
Yeah, and so that you're, like you said, you're helping bring that water to the surface to replenish with oxygen and mixing in a pond like that. This regular mixing, preventing that separation or that stratification of the water column, that can be a really good thing through the summertime too.
Yeah, what it also does is it keeps that entire water column aerobic. And so all the plants that are dying through the summer and early fall, in an aerobic situation, Mother Nature degrades those and they decompose very efficiently. anaerobic decomposition is a very, very poor, slow way to decomp things. And you get sludge set up, or you get plant material building, that muck layer. But aeration keeps everything aerobic. And so you have a lot less decomposition through the winter because you decompose that in an efficient way through the summer as it died. And you don't get a buildup of this aquatic muck at the bottom that's always anaerobic and always creating CO2 and things like that. So aeration not only helps the oxygen level and helps the fish, it helps the whole ecosystem be more aerobic and more vigorous.
Okay. So, I don't have a pond on my property. I haven't, done aeration on a pond. Is it expensive for pond owners to put these aerators in? I'm sure it differs depending on the type and all that sort of stuff. But is that something that they should be really planning for a significant investment in, or is it a bit more manageable than that?
It's not inexpensive. Don't get me wrong.
Uh-huh.
A one diffuser system for a 3/4 acre lake that's 10 foot deep, you're looking at somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000 for the equipment.
Okay.
And then each diffuser is probably, you're going to up the size of the pump. You're going to do things like that. And so, yeah, there's some expense there. But if you love those fish and you've spent all the time and effort and energy in managing those fish, this is a pretty good insurance policy. Most of these systems, if you buy quality on the front end, my dad used to say that the most expensive tool you're ever going to buy is a cheap one. So if you go out and try to save $100 on the front end of an aerator, you're probably going to have to buy another one. But if you buy a quality one, and some of the good quality systems that are out there, you can get 15 to 20 years with good quality maintenance, keeping things maintained. So you can get a long life out of these aeration systems.
Okay.
That's a good life tip.
Yeah, I think I had, I think it was my PhD advisor used to always tell me, buy cheap, buy twice. So,
or more.
Yeah.
I've had people call me and they want to use an air compressor. Well, I tell them go out and turn their air compressor on and let it run for an hour, and then tell me if it made it an hour without melting down. So just, an air compressor is not designed to run 24/7. So these are designed to run cool. They're designed not to have any way that oil or any kind of oil vapor can get in the airlines. So they're designed to be used in an aquatic system, and they're specially maintained for that. I've had people ask me about windmill aerators. The problem with having a windmill aerator is, in my neck of the woods, the wind doesn't blow the last couple hours a night. And that's the most stressful oxygenation period in a pond, is always the last hour of dark. And so if we have an area that doesn't work when the pond's the most stressful, we're not really fixing that situation. So I'm not a great big fan of windmill aerators unless you're going to supplement that with a motor that runs when the wind's not blowing. So if people want a windmill and it looks really neat, you can have a kind of a combination system, but don't just rely on the wind to do this job.
It sounds like, if people are interested in getting some aeration for their ponds, they need to do some research. They need to speak to some people to figure out what's best for their pond. And while you said it's not an inexpensive, investment, a lot of people spend thousands of dollars putting fish in their ponds, and a lot of people buy property just because it's got a pond on it that they can fish in. And so if you consider some of those expenses, like you said, Dave, this having some aeration as an insurance policy is not that expensive, and will hopefully save you money in the long run.
Yeah. I mean, if I get 20 years out of a system and it costs me $2,000, my investment's $100 a year for my insurance policy. So you got to look at the longevity of this, not just always the upfront cost.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. So we've talked about, managing things in your pond throughout the year to prepare it for winter, making sure that you remove some of that vegetation biomass throughout the year so that the pond isn't inundated with decaying vegetation in the fall. We've talked about how you can prevent some of these issues by minimizing the ice and snow that's on the pond. And now we also just spoke a little bit about aeration and how that can help both in the winter and throughout the year as well. Dave, do you have any other topics or any other recommendations people should think about with concerning ponds in the wintertime?
Enjoy them. They're not just a summertime activity. If you've never tried to ice fish, when you get good 4 and 5 inches of good healthy ice where it's good safe to take the family and the kids out there, take a kid ice fishing. Once you find where the fish are in a pond, they are as catchable or maybe more catchable through the ice than anyone would believe. And they taste better because they come right out of the cold water onto the ice straight to the cooler, so they're not degrading at all. So I think that the fish we catch out of an icy cold situation is twice as good. Not that I don't eat bluegill that I catch in the summer, but the bluegill you catch through the ice will taste even better. And any of the fish, the channel cat, bass, crappie, all those fish taste better. Their metabolism is slowed down. So if they're feeding on things in the bottom of the pond and they're running that muck through their systems and they kind of get an off flavor to the fish, all that's gone because those fish haven't been doing that. So take advantage of your fish population, take advantage of the recreation, and get out and enjoy the ponds that you have in the winter as well as in the summer.
That's some great advice. I tell you, I've done a little bit of ice fishing on ponds here since moving from Australia, and it's a lot of fun catching a bass on an ice fishing pole compared to catching a bass in the summertime. So, I never thought that this Aussie would be into ice fishing, but when it gets cold enough, I enjoy getting out and ice fishing. So we like to ask our guests if they have any recommendations for the listeners in terms of maybe books or videos or podcasts, relating to, could be ponds, could be fish in general, anything like that. So do you have any recommendations for our listeners, Dave?
I like the publications we've worked on. I think they've got a good basic scientific approach to fish management and things like that. So look for the publications that are on our pond website and wildlife website through the forestry department. If you're wanting a video series and you're thinking about renovating a pond or building a pond or lake, most people build ponds and lakes that are not good fish habitat. They're building them just to hold water, and we really need to build them as a habitat. So Ray Scott, about 30 years ago, developed a video series called Great Small Waters. And if you've got questions about managing your pond and things like that, Great Small Waters is a wonderful video series put out by the guy that founded the BASS tournament series years ago. Really good research-based support behind this video and the things that he suggests as far as habitat and renovation and fish numbers. The one thing in the Midwest you want to just close your ears to is we do not fertilize ponds in the Midwest. They talk about fertilization in some of the series, but that's a Southern thing, not a Midwestern thing. But that's a great resource if somebody wants to get one for Christmas. And it's still available out there through some of the pond supply online sites.
Great. Yeah, we might provide a link or two in the show notes here so that people can chase that video series down. I've had that series recommended to me before too. I haven't watched it yet, but it sounds like it's great viewing for pond management.
And the last thing I would tell people is I work for Extension. My numbers, all you got to do is Dave Osborne, Purdue Extension. And if you've got a personal question or want to run your scenario past me, that's what I'm here for. Call me anytime, and I love to talk ponds. Great.
And given at the start of this episode, Dave, you spoke a little bit about your experiences and what you've done with ponds. And, I bet, it's a pretty sure bet that we're going to have to get you back on this show again because you have a huge wealth of knowledge on all things pond management. And that's what we're trying to communicate with this podcast.
Be happy to do it.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Dave. We've really enjoyed learning about how to manage your pond for winter, and I've definitely learned a lot. And
I've learned a lot too. So much on this episode.
Yeah, and so thanks for joining us, Dave. I hope you can get out and enjoy the fall and the winter this year. I hope you get some ice fishing in, and hopefully we'll talk to you again soon.
Yeah. Get out there and use and enjoy our natural resources. They're renewable. That's what they're for.
That's absolutely right. So, Megan, what was one thing that you learned or found interesting from this episode?
I really like the aeration portion. So driving around, I guess in the middle of nowhere, Indiana, like driving around past a lot of these farm ponds. Now I'm wondering if the fountains that I was seeing were actually doing anything for their ponds, or like the ones that didn't seem to have anything on them. Did they have some submerged diffusion aerators that were moving the water? So I thought that was really, really neat.
Yeah, me too. I get a lot of questions about aeration. I know a little bit about aeration, but like I said, I don't have experience implementing aeration in ponds, and I know Dave has worked with a lot of pond owners to help them get their aeration system set up. And I wasn't aware that there were so many different types of aeration, and I didn't, I hadn't thought about using different types of aerators depending on the depth of your pond too. So,
or even if you want something to be pretty, like a windmill aerator, to supplement that with something, because the wind isn't blowing the last hour of the night. That blew my mind too.
Yeah. And, I think a lot of people are interested in using things like wind or solar to run some of these aeration systems. But I think he made an excellent point that that's all well and good to do, but you may need to supplement it at some of those key periods of time. And just that little bit of supplementation can actually help make the system much, much more effective.
And I also really liked, it may be $2,000 right now, but if it lasts you for 20 years, that's $100 a year. That's not bad. That's not a bad investment at all.
No, not at all. Considering if you've got to restock your fish every other year, then that can really start to add up.
Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and spread the word. You can do that by word of mouth. You can do that by reviewing or rating us, and that will ping different people that are interested in what you've been listening to find our podcast. So if you have any comments or suggestions for topics, you can shoot us an email, or you can find us on social media. Mitch, can they find you on social media?
You can find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @TheAussieWahoo. I'll put that down in the show notes. You can find me there. And then the other best way to contact me is probably via the Pond and Wildlife website. We have a contact form there that you can fill out that directly takes you to me.
You can find me on Twitter @_TFFP. Also consider subscribing to Natural Resource University and other Natural Resource University podcasts. So, Mitch, what should our listeners expect to hear from us next?
So on the next episode, we want to continue our trend of talking about topical issues. And so we're going to focus still on winter management. And, we mentioned in this episode that ponds can form ice over them and some of the issues that can cause for pond systems. But when ice forms on ponds, it also gives us an opportunity to do some things on that pond that we might not have during the summer. One of those is placing fish habitat. And so you can drag certain types of fish habitat out onto the ice, and then when the ice melts, that habitat falls down into the pond right where you want it. And so we're going to have a guest from the Indiana Department of Natural Resources come on and talk a little bit about fish habitats in general, and how maybe you can build and place some of these fish habitats out during the winter.
I'm excited.
Great. Well, thanks everyone, and we will see you all here for the next podcast episode. Cheerio.
Cool beans. See ya.
Pond University is hosted by Purdue University and Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. Pond University is part of the podcast network Natural Resources University, which is supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you liked Pond University, then check out the other podcasts in the Natural Resources University podcast network. Purdue University and Illinois Indiana Sea Grant are equal opportunity, equal access, and affirmative action institutions.
Natural Resources University is funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. New episodes are released every Tuesday. For more information, follow us on our social media platforms at NR_University.